Everyone thought the shivering girl outside the cafe was just another runaway. Her coat was threadbare, her shoes worn to the sole. She never asked for money, only warmth. But when waitress Eliza brought her a cup of coffee and a quiet place to sit, she noticed the posture, the careful words, the eyes that had seen mansions and marble halls. What Eliza didn't know was that the girl had vanished 3 weeks earlier from a world of private jets and press conferences. She was Amelia Sterling, heiress to one of the most powerful fortunes in the country, now hiding from a life that had broken her heart. What began as an act of kindness would unravel a secret that could change both their lives forever. The sun had barely risen, but the cafe was already humming with the comforting clatter of ceramic mugs and the rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine. Eliza moved like a current through the cozy chaos, refilling coffee cups with one hand and jotting down orders with the other. She wore a tired but genuine smile, the kind that made regulars feel seen and strangers feel welcome. Outside the large front windows, the early morning light filtered through streaks of gray clouds, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the cold just beyond the glass, where the city was still shaking off the chill of the night. Eliza's apron was already dusted with flour and coffee grounds, but her mind was miles away, calculating the number of hours she needed to make rent this month and the looming cost of her brother's new wheelchair repair. Her life was a balancing act of silent burdens, a string of worries held together by strong hands and stronger coffee. She had just handed off an order of eggs Benedict to a table of bankers when her eyes caught a flicker of movement across the street. Perched on a cracked milk crate just outside the alley was a girl no older than 20, wrapped in a tattered coat several sizes too big. Her hair was tangled and hung in damp waves around her face, her arms hugged tight across her chest, knees pulled in. She was still but alert, the way animals are when they do not trust safety. Eliza paused mid-step, a slight furrow creasing her brow. She had seen hundreds of people pass by that window, but something about this girl held her attention. It was not just the condition she was in. It was the way she sat perfectly upright, like her dignity refused to collapse, even if her body had. The girl looked straight ahead, not panhandling, not crying, not even moving, just sitting in silence, like a statue carved from cold. Eliza glanced around the cafe. A regular waved for more jam. A toddler shrieked with joy over a chocolate muffin. But her focus drifted back to the girl outside. The world was moving, but she was stuck. Something about her felt misplaced, like a violin left in the rain. Eliza excused herself to the back counter and poured a fresh cup of coffee, wrapping it in a cardboard sleeve. She added a splash of cream without asking why. She did not know who the girl was, or why she sat there looking like a ghost too proud to ask for help, but something deep in Eliza's chest pulled her toward that crate on the sidewalk. Without fanfare or second-guessing, she stepped outside, her shoes clicking softly against the wet concrete. The cold bit into her skin instantly. Still, she walked straight up to the girl and offered her the cup with both hands. Whatever this was, Eliza knew it was the start of something that would not stay small. The door gave a soft chime as Eliza stepped outside, the mug cradled carefully in her hands, steam curling upward like a gentle invitation. The air was sharper than it looked through the glass, and her breath came out in thin clouds as she crossed the short stretch of pavement between the warm cafe and the edge of the sidewalk where the girl still sat, unmoving. The sounds of the city filtered in slowly, the distant roar of a bus engine, the soft patter of damp shoes on pavement. But in that moment, the world felt quiet. Eliza approached without haste, her steps unthreatening, her posture open. She stopped just far enough to not feel imposing but close enough to be noticed. The girl's head lifted slightly at the sound, her eyes dark and wary beneath her tangled hair. When Eliza extended the cup toward her, the girl flinched, her body tightening like a spring. And for a heartbeat, she looked as though she might run. Eliza held her ground. her voice low and even, not urgent, not soft with pity, just real. Thought you might need something warm. The girl's gaze flicked from the cup to Eliza's face, scanning for hidden meaning, for the strings that usually came with kindness. Her hands stayed in her coat sleeves, tucked tightly into her sides. Then, slowly, she reached out and took the mug, wrapping her fingers around it like it was a lifeline. "Thank you." Her voice was nearly a whisper, but it carried. Eliza gave a single nod, neither smile nor frown, just a quiet acknowledgement. No follow-up questions, no asking her name, no assumptions. She just stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked back into the café. Behind her, the girl lifted the cup and took a sip, her face unreadable. Inside, Eliza returned to her post behind the counter, but her thoughts lingered outside. She had met hundreds of customers, served coffee to tired nurses, broken tourists, and chatty teenagers. But none of them had looked at her the way this girl did, like someone waiting for the world to confirm whether it would hurt or help. Something in that brief exchange settled in Eliza's gut. This girl was not just lost. She was hiding, and not from the cold. The warmth of the cafe wrapped around her again, but her gaze drifted back to the window, to the shadow just barely visible on the edge of the street. She had given her coffee, but the real gift was that she had not asked questions. And that, somehow, was what made the girl speak. In that one quiet moment, the bond had formed, fragile as glass but real. Whatever story this stranger carried, it had just brushed against Eliza's life, and neither of them knew yet how far that ripple would reach. Leah sat tucked into the corner booth, the oversized hoodie draped around her thin frame, the warmth of the cafe seeping into her bones as if it were trying to thaw something deeper than just the damp chill from the rain. From her seat she had a clear view of the room, and while she kept her head slightly bowed to avoid drawing attention, her eyes followed Eliza as she moved effortlessly through the space. There was no grandness to her gestures, no rehearsed charm meant to impress. Yet every action carried a weight of sincerity that struck Leah in a place she had long since buried. She watched Eliza laugh softly with a mother juggling two restless children, sliding an extra muffin onto their tray with a wink that said no charge. She saw her pause to steady the arm of an elderly man struggling with his cane, guiding him to a booth with the gentle patience of someone who understood the dignity of being seen, not pitied. When a group of tired construction workers filed in, Eliza greeted them with the same warmth she offered the businesswoman in a tailored suit who ordered a latte to go, her kindness unshaped by status or wealth. To Leah, it felt almost foreign. In the world she had run from, interactions were transactions, every smile measured, every gesture calculated for advantage. Here, kindness seemed to bloom naturally, uncoaxed and unpriced. Leah felt a sting in her chest, not from envy, but from recognition of how empty her own world had been despite its riches. Her fingers tightened around the mug, steam rising into her face, blurring her view for just a moment, before she whispered so quietly she almost hoped no one could hear. "No one in my world acts like this." The words were not meant for Eliza, nor for the cafe filled with the soft hum of ordinary lives unfolding. They were for herself, an acknowledgement that the life she had been forced to lead had stolen something essential, something that was alive here in the way Eliza handed a napkin to a child with chocolate on his chin, or the way she offered a tired smile to a customer who looked invisible everywhere else. Leah's chest ached with the contradiction, her polished voice and refined upbringing clashing with the raw humility of the moment. She had grown up surrounded by chandeliers, boardrooms, and gala dinners. Yet none of it had carried the quiet grace she now witnessed in a woman who earned her living one cup of coffee at a time. Watching Eliza work was like watching a different definition of wealth play out before her eyes, one built on compassion instead of power. For the first time in weeks, Leah felt her guard slip ever so slightly, her admiration beginning to take root in silence, her secrets safe for now, her heart no longer entirely closed. The cafe had thinned out after the rush, leaving only the soft murmur of a few lingering conversations and the clink of cutlery against plates. Eliza wiped down a nearby table, her gaze drifting every so often toward the corner booth where Leah sat with her mug cradled close, the steam curling around her face like a fragile veil. Something about the girl tugged at Eliza's instincts, a quiet pull she could not ignore. When the floor was clear enough to allow a pause, she slid into the booth across from her guest, her tone casual, though her eyes studied carefully. "So, where are you headed?" she asked, resting her chin on her hand as though it were idle curiosity. Leah's grip tightened slightly on the mug, her polished voice steady but cautious as she replied, "Just passing through." Eliza tilted her head, noting the neatness of her phrasing, the clarity of her words, so unlike the rough edges of most drifters she had met over the years. "No ID, no job, just moving," Leah added, her eyes flicking down to the table rather than meeting Eliza's. Eliza leaned back, crossing her arms, her brow furrowing ever so slightly. "You talk like someone who's never had to clean grease traps," she remarked, her tone light but probing. For a brief second, the corners of Leah's lips curved into the faintest smile, a small break in the carefully guarded mask. "Maybe I haven't," she said softly, the words carrying a mix of truth and evasion. Eliza held her gaze a moment longer, sensing the weight of secrets tucked neatly behind those eyes, but she chose not to push further. Instead, she gave a small shrug, as though to say the matter could rest for now. The air between them shifted, something unspoken, passing from guarded stranger to tentative connection. Eliza felt the beginnings of a puzzle forming in her mind, pieces that did not quite fit together, yet she knew instinctively that the picture would matter. Leah, for her part, felt the strange comfort of being seen yet not interrogated, a relief she had not known in her gilded world where every question was sharpened to an edge. Around them the cafe remained ordinary, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint scrape of a chair. But in that small booth a thread had been tied, delicate and thin, binding two lives together in quiet recognition. Neither spoke again for a while, but Eliza carried the weight of her suspicion like a stone in her pocket, and Leah carried the echo of her soft smile like a secret she almost wished she could share. The cafe lights glowed softer in the evening, their golden haze reflecting against polished wood and glass as the last customers drifted out into the cool night. The door shut with a final chime, leaving only the low hum of the refrigerators and the faint notes of jazz drifting from the old speaker near the counter. Eliza tied her apron tighter and began her familiar routine, wiping tables, stacking chairs, sweeping crumbs into neat piles. She moved with practiced ease, her body knowing the motions as well as it knew breathing. From the corner booth, Leah rose slowly, the oversized hoodie slipping from one shoulder. "I should help," she said, her voice firm despite its softness. Eliza glanced up, surprised, a broom halfway across the floor. "You are a guest," she replied with a gentle shake of her head. Leah crossed the room anyway, determination plain in her posture. She reached for a stack of plates, but nearly lost her balance when they clinked together, too heavy in her grip. Eliza rushed to steady them, laughing quietly, not unkindly. "Careful. Those are not as forgiving as cardboard boxes." Leah gave a sheepish grin, her cheeks coloring faintly. "I will learn," she insisted. True to her word, she did not retreat. She fumbled with the spray bottle at first, wiping in wide, uneven strokes that left streaks. But when Eliza demonstrated, Leah copied with sharp focus, each attempt more precise than the last. Her hands, elegant yet untrained, grew steadier as she stacked cups, refolded napkins, and finally swept, though the broom seemed comically oversized in her grasp. Eliza watched quietly, touched in a way she did not expect. There was no entitlement in Leah's effort, no hesitation to soil her fingers on work that clearly did not belong to her world. Instead, there was something earnest, a desire not just to repay but to belong. The cafe filled with the rhythm of shared labor, Two women moving in tandem under the dim lights, their shadows stretching long across the tiled floor. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the street lamps glistening on wet pavement. Inside, the warmth deepened, not from the heaters, but from the simple act of two hands meeting purpose. When at last the final chair was lifted onto a table and the broom leaned back in its corner, Eliza looked at Leah and found herself smiling. Not the polite smile she wore for customers, but one of genuine admiration. "You did well," she said softly. Leah's chest lifted with pride, her breath fogging slightly in the cool air that seeped through the doorframe. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt useful, not as a symbol or a name, but as a person who had contributed, however clumsily, to something real. In the quiet hum of closing hours, with jazz playing faintly and the smell of coffee lingering in the air, a new rhythm was set. It was not just Eliza's cafe anymore. It was a place Leah was beginning, slowly, to call her own. Morning light spilled into the cafe, turning the steam from fresh espresso into golden clouds that drifted lazily above the counter. The rush had returned in full, regulars calling greetings and new faces studying menus with sleepy eyes. Eliza moved between tables with practiced ease, her hands steady even as her mind flicked between orders and the bills waiting at home. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Leah hovering near the counter, her posture relaxed yet observant, as if she had been studying every detail since she first sat in that corner booth. When a young barista stepped away to deliver pastries, a customer leaned impatiently against the counter, rattling off an order in a hurried voice. Before Eliza could intervene, Leah slid behind the machine, her fingers moving with confidence that seemed impossibly natural. She adjusted the portafilter, measured, tamped, and pulled a perfect shot on the first try, her movements fluid and practiced as though she had been doing it for years. Eliza froze mid-step, watching as the dark liquid streamed smoothly into the cup, topped with a froth that even the regular barista sometimes struggled to achieve. The customer muttered thanks and moved away, oblivious to the miracle they had just witnessed. Eliza approached slowly, her brow arched. "You sure you have never worked in a place like this?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp with curiosity. Leah turned, startled, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. "I read a lot," she replied quickly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, her voice too polished to sound convincing. Before Eliza could press further, the bell above the door chimed, and a tourist couple entered, flipping through a guidebook as they settled at a table. When the man struggled to explain his order in broken English, Leah stepped forward without hesitation, switching to flawless French, her accent smooth and natural, her words spilling out like water from a hidden spring. The tourists lit up with relief, their conversation easing as Leah translated effortlessly, her expression calm, almost elegant. Eliza watched in silence, her suspicion deepening with each syllable. This was no drifter learning from books in the dark corners of libraries. This was refinement, the kind that came from tutors and travels, the kind polished by privilege. Yet here she was, wrapped in a hoodie, pouring coffee like a volunteer trying to disappear. Eliza crossed her arms, leaning against the counter as Leah returned, her eyes carefully avoiding contact. She wanted to press, to demand answers, but she swallowed the urge. Something told her the truth would come in its own time. Still, the puzzle pieces were piling up. Perfect espresso, perfect French, perfect poise. Eliza's instincts tightened, whispering that the story Leah offered was a mask stitched together from fragments of half-truths. And though the customers around them carried on with muffins and chatter, Eliza knew this moment had shifted something. The girl in the hoodie was not who she claimed to be, and the mystery that wrapped around her had just deepened, drawing Eliza further into its pull. The cafe was alive with the gentle hum of midday, the clinking of cutlery, the hiss of steamed milk, and the comfortable murmur of voices blending into a rhythm that felt almost like a song. Leah had settled into a quiet rhythm herself, helping Eliza clear plates and wipe down counters, her movements no longer hesitant but still tinged with a careful reserve. She was growing braver in small ways, standing a little taller, offering faint smiles to customers who thanked her. Yet the fragility of her calm was shattered in an instant when a middle-aged couple entered, their coats damp from the drizzle outside. They ordered coffee and pastries, then took a seat by the window, their conversation light at first until the man's gaze lingered too long on the corner of the room where Leah stood. He leaned toward his wife, his voice lowered but not low enough to escape the quiet that fell just then between tables. "That girl looks like Amelia Sterling, from the news." The words slid across the cafe like a crack of thunder, subtle to some, shattering to others. Eliza stiffened, her heart giving a jolt as her eyes flicked to Leah. The girl's face paled, her breath caught, and in the next moment she set down the tray in her hands with a clumsy thud. Without a word, she turned and walked quickly toward the restroom at the back of the cafe. The door shut behind her with a click that sounded louder than it should have, leaving Eliza frozen with a mix of shock and dawning clarity. Amelia Sterling. The name rang through her mind like a bell, one she recognized faintly from newspaper headlines and flickering television reports. The missing daughter of one of the wealthiest families in the country, vanished without explanation, speculations swirling like vultures around her disappearance. Eliza glanced back at the couple. The wife shook her head, whispering something about how ridiculous it sounded, but the husband remained unconvinced, his eyes still narrowing at the empty booth Leah had fled. Minutes ticked by. Then 10. The sound of jazz on the cafe speaker and the scrape of forks against plates filled the silence Leah had left. But Eliza's thoughts were fixed on the restroom door that remained firmly closed. By the 20th minute, worry tugged at her chest. She moved toward the hallway, her steps soft, her mind racing with questions she was not ready to ask aloud. Behind that door, Leah was no longer just a girl in an oversized hoodie. She was someone who carried a name heavy enough to draw whispers from strangers and stories from news anchors. The stakes had shifted. The girl hiding in her cafe was not simply running from hunger or bad luck. She was running from a life so vast and visible that even a passing customer could pierce her disguise with a glance. When Leah finally emerged from the restroom, her face was washed pale, her eyes rimmed with the kind of fear that was practiced in silence rather than confessed in words. Eliza had been waiting, a damp cloth in her hands. Her nerves wound tight like a string. She watched the girl cross the cafe floor, the hoodie pulled close around her, her posture hunched as though trying to fold herself into invisibility. Eliza set the cloth down, stepping into her path, her voice quiet but firm. "If someone is looking for you, you should tell me. I can help." For a brief instant, Leah froze, her eyes flashing wide, her breath catching in her throat. Then the calm cracked, replaced by fire that startled Eliza with its sharpness. "No one helps. Not when they think you are property." The words cut through the cafe air, trembling with rage and despair. And customers nearby glanced up, startled by the sudden edge in a place usually filled with the soft notes of jazz and the smell of coffee. Eliza's chest tightened, the truth of the outburst sinking into her bones. She wanted to reach out, to ask what kind of world turned a young woman into a possession. But before she could speak, Leah turned sharply, her chair scraping loudly against the tiled floor. Her face was set like stone, her jaw trembling as though holding back words that might break her completely. She strode toward the door, each step quick and uneven, and then the chime of the bell marked her exit. The door swung open into the gray afternoon, and rain poured down in sheets, soaking her instantly as she vanished into the blur of the street. Eliza stood frozen, her hand half raised, the warmth of the cafe, a painful contrast to the storm outside. Her heart beat hard against her ribs, torn between letting her go and chasing her into the rain. Around her, the cafe seemed to still, every sound muffled as though the world had paused to mark the moment. Eliza swallowed hard, her throat thick with frustration and worry. The bond they had been carefully weaving had unraveled in a flash of anger and pain, leaving only questions hanging heavy in the air. Who was she really? And what kind of life could drive someone to run until they were nothing more than a shadow at the edge of a rainy street? The confrontation had ripped the veil of mystery wider, and though Leah had walked out into the storm, Eliza knew with a certainty that pressed against her chest that this was not an ending. It was the beginning of something larger, something that would pull both of them deeper into a truth neither was ready to face. The cafe was silent after closing, the chairs stacked on tables, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound left to keep Eliza company. She sat at the counter with her laptop open, the screen casting a pale glow across her tired face. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for several long seconds before she finally began typing the words that had haunted her since the couple's whisper earlier that day. Amelia Sterling missing. The search engine bloomed with results instantly, pages upon pages of headlines, some screaming in bold letters about the heiress who had vanished 3 weeks ago, others dripping with speculation and scandal. Eliza clicked the first article, her breath held tight in her chest. It detailed how Amelia Sterling, daughter of industrial magnate Charles Sterling, had disappeared suddenly after rumors of an arranged engagement to a much older international investor. Family representatives claimed she was taking time for herself, while tabloids spat out wilder theories that ranged from secret rehab stints to rebellious escapes with a mystery lover. Eliza scrolled slowly, her eyes scanning every line, her heart pounding harder with each word. She opened another article, then another, her stomach tightening as a single photograph finally stopped her cold. The image was crisp and bright, taken at a charity gala just a few months before her disappearance. Amelia Sterling stood poised beside her father, her dark hair gleaming, her posture elegant, her smile polished and practiced. But it was the eyes that caught Eliza, the same wary gaze, the same flicker of defiance wrapped in quiet sorrow. She zoomed in on the photo, her pulse thundering in her ears. There was no mistaking it. Leah and Amelia were the same person. Eliza leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly as the weight of the revelation settled over her. She closed her eyes for a moment, flashes of memory colliding in her mind. The perfect espresso on the first try, the fluent French to the tourists, the polished voice that did not fit the hoodie and damp hair. It all made sense now, but the sense only deepened the mystery. Why would a girl with every privilege, every protection, every door open to her, choose instead to hide in the corner of a cafe, clutching borrowed clothes and speaking like someone fleeing a cage? Eliza rubbed her temples, a mix of dread and sympathy swirling inside her. This was not just a runaway. This was a name heavy enough to bring cameras, headlines, and danger crashing through the doors of her quiet cafe. She looked again at the photograph on her screen, at the perfect smile that did not reach Amelia's eyes, and whispered into the empty room. It is her. The truth was no longer just suspicion. The girl she had offered coffee to on the street was a billionaire's daughter in hiding, and Eliza now stood on the edge of a storm that could change both of their lives forever. The next morning broke gray and brittle, the kind of day where the air itself felt like unspoken warning. And Eliza moved through the cafe with a heaviness she could not shake. Her mind kept circling back to the photo she had studied the night before. Amelia Sterling in a glittering gown with a smile carved for cameras, so far removed from the girl who had wrapped herself in a borrowed hoodie and whispered her name as Leah. The bell above the door rang, and Eliza glanced up, expecting a customer in need of coffee against the gloom. But what entered instead was a man who carried the kind of presence that shifted the air in a room. He wore a tailored coat of dark wool, every line of his clothing precise, his shoes polished to a mirror shine that seemed out of place on the worn tile floor. His eyes were what froze Eliza, though, pale and cold, scanning the cafe with calculated precision as if each corner might hold the answer he sought. He stepped to the counter, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "I am looking for someone. A young woman." He paused just long enough to let the silence stretch before adding, "She may have called herself Leah." Eliza felt her stomach twist, her hands tightening around the rag she had been holding. She forced her tone steady, her face a careful mask of disinterest. "We serve many people here," she replied, perhaps too quickly. The man leaned closer, lowering his voice, though the edge in it carried like a blade. "I represent Sterling Family Security. She is unwell, unstable. The family is worried. If she returns, you will call us immediately." He slid a card across the counter, its embossed lettering gleaming faintly under the soft lights. Eliza glanced at it without touching. The name of the Sterling Empire stamped clear in gold. She lifted her gaze back to the man, meeting those icy eyes with her own, and gave a small nod she did not mean. The man studied her for a moment longer, as though measuring the depth of her loyalty, then straightened, buttoned his coat, and left with the same quiet menace with which he had entered. The bell above the door chimed again, but the sound felt hollow now, the cafe's warmth chilled by the echo of his presence. Eliza let out a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding, her heart thudding against her ribs. He had not asked. He had declared. And though he had left, his shadow lingered. The truth was no longer just something Eliza had pieced together on a glowing laptop screen. It was standing in front of her with cold eyes and a warning disguised as concern. Leah was not just missing. She was being hunted, and Eliza's quiet cafe had just been marked as part of the search. Night settled heavy over the city, the rain returning in fits that left the streets slick and shining under the jaundiced glow of the street lamps. Eliza closed the cafe with her movements slower than usual, her mind thick with worry. The card from Sterling Family Security still sat on the counter where she had left it, untouched but burning in her thoughts. She locked the door, drew her jacket tight, and turned toward the alley that cut behind the building, an instinct she could not explain pulling her there. The shadows were deep, but in the corner where crates were stacked and garbage bins lined the wall, she spotted a small form curled tightly into itself. Leah lay on the damp concrete, her hair tangled across her face, the oversized hoodie soaked through, her body trembling with shivers she could not suppress. Eliza dropped to her knees beside her, the sight striking like a blade. Without hesitation, she touched her shoulder gently. Leah stirred, her eyes fluttering open, wide and glazed with exhaustion. Eliza whispered with quiet urgency, "You cannot do this alone. Let me help." For a heartbeat, Leah stared at her, confusion swimming through her gaze, then her body gave way to sobs that shook her thin frame. She pressed her hands to her face. The sound raw and broken, the sound of someone who had been holding the world's weight for too long. Through the heaving breaths, words spilled out between the sobs. "I did not run because I was crazy. I ran because they were going to sell me off like stock." Eliza's heart clenched, the enormity of the confession pressing into her chest. She did not speak. She simply lifted the girl into her arms with steady determination, ignoring the cold rain that plastered her hair to her face, and carried her back through the alley door. Inside, the cafe was dark except for the soft glow of a single lamp. Eliza pulled blankets from the storage closet, wrapping them around Leah until the shivers began to ease. She brewed a pot of tea, the smell of chamomile filling the air, and set it on the table near the couch where Leah now sat, small and fragile beneath the layers of cloth. Eliza's eyes never left her. Her own exhaustion forgotten in the urgency of keeping this girl from unraveling completely. The storm outside beat against the windows, but inside the walls of the cafe the world was still, as if holding its breath for the truth that had just cracked through. Leah's words echoed, sharp and devastating, not just a runaway but a prisoner fleeing a gilded cage. For the first time, the distance between waitress and heiress collapsed, leaving only two women in the quiet night, one offering warmth, the other offering her broken truth. The cafe was cloaked in the hush of midnight, the rain having softened to a steady drizzle that tapped against the windows like a heartbeat. The lamps cast pools of amber light across the floor, and the air smelled faintly of chamomile from the half-drunk tea cooling on the table. Wrapped in layers of blankets, Leah sat curled into the corner of the couch, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with the residue of tears. Eliza sat across from her, leaning forward with elbows on her knees. Her expression steady but open, the silence between them thick with the weight of unsaid things. At last, Leah drew a deep breath and began to speak, her voice low but sharp with the clarity of someone unburdening truths long locked away. "My father arranged an engagement," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Not for love, not for me, but for a deal. A merger with an international investor twice my age. He told me it was an opportunity for the family, that I would be securing our legacy." Her words cracked slightly, but she pushed on. "I was not his daughter. I was leverage, a pawn in their empire." Her hands twisted the blanket as she spoke, knuckles whitening. "My trust fund has more autonomy than I do." The bitterness in her tone sliced through the quiet, leaving Eliza still and aching. Leah's gaze flickered upward for the first time, her eyes wet but fierce. "He never asked me what I wanted. My mother never spoke a word against him. She just smiled, silent, complicit. I screamed at them once, said I would rather die than be bartered like property. My father told me I was being dramatic, that girls like me did not get choices, only obligations." Her voice broke then, a sob strangled into silence, and she pressed the blanket tighter around herself as though it could shield her from the memory. Eliza's throat tightened, her chest heavy with a mix of anger and sorrow. She wanted to reach across the space, to take Leah's hand, but she held herself steady, letting the girl's truth spill unbroken. For the first time, the image of Amelia Sterling from the glossy photos dissolved, replaced by a fragile, furious young woman stripped of illusions, not a symbol of wealth or scandal, but a person fighting to be seen as more than a bargaining chip. The silence stretched after Leah's words, filled only by the steady patter of rain. Eliza finally spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "You are not property, and you are not alone anymore." Leah's shoulders sagged, the words sinking into the cracks of her armor, not enough to heal, but enough to hold. In that quiet moment, she was no longer the missing heiress from the headlines. She was simply a girl, trembling in the lamplight, finally telling her story to someone who would not turn away. The rain had quieted to a misty whisper outside, the city settling into the deep stillness of night. And inside the café the lamps glowed low, casting the room in a hushed intimacy that felt like a cocoon. Leah's confession hung in the air, raw and jagged, the echo of her words still vibrating in Eliza's chest. For a long while neither spoke, the silence heavy but not empty. The kind of silence that holds room for truth. At last, Eliza leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, her eyes fixed on the faint rings of tea left on the table. "You are not the only one who has been used by circumstance," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of memory. "My parents died when I was 19. A car accident on a night that should have been ordinary. One phone call and my whole world changed." She glanced up at Leah, her eyes steady but shimmering with old grief. "I had a scholarship waiting for me. College. A chance to study literature, to build something for myself. But my brother was only 11, and he has a disability that requires constant care. There was no one else, so I put the books away, traded classes for double shifts, and learned to live inside responsibility that never asked what I wanted." Leah's breath caught, her eyes widening, the raw edges of her own pain softening into recognition. Eliza gave a small, wry smile that carried both sorrow and pride. "We are both survivors, just different battlefields." The words slipped between them like a bridge, narrowing the gap of class and circumstance, tying together the heiress who fled a gilded prison and the waitress who built a life from sacrifice. Leah's shoulders eased, the tension in her posture loosening as though the shared weight had made hers lighter. She whispered, barely audible, "You gave up everything for him." Eliza shook her head gently. "I gave up one dream, but I kept my family. That matters more than anything. And now, He is my reason to keep moving." For the first time, Leah let herself look directly into Eliza's eyes, and in that exchange was something unspoken but unmistakable. Respect, empathy, kinship. The cafe around them seemed to fade. The jazz from the old speaker, nothing more than background to the bond forming across the small table. Two women, strangers only days before, now tethered by the simple truth that both had been forged by loss and duty. Their worlds could not have been more different, yet their wounds were carved from the same knife of sacrifice. And in that quiet exchange, a seed of trust took root, not tentative this time, but certain, growing in the rich soil of shared survival. The cafe felt strangely hushed the next afternoon, as if the air itself had taken on the weight of choices yet to be made. Eliza worked quietly behind the counter, her movements slower, more thoughtful, her gaze flicking often toward the corner where Leah sat, her hood pushed back, her hair still damp from the drizzle outside. The events of the past day hung over them both like a storm cloud, and the world beyond the cafe had not forgotten either. A neatly dressed woman had arrived earlier with a folder tucked under her arm, her polite smile stretched too tight, her words smooth and rehearsed. She claimed to be a liaison sent by the Sterling family, insisting she carried an offer meant to shield Leah from further scandal. "A new identity," the woman had said. "A carefully planned retreat, where the press could not hound her, where whispers of disgrace would never reach her ears." It was, in truth, a gilded cage dressed in softer bars. Eliza had stood close by, arms folded, watching Leah's face as the words unfolded, seeing the flicker of temptation battle with the steel beneath her skin. When the woman finally left, her card untouched on the table, the silence thickened, broken only by the soft hiss of the espresso machine. Leah leaned back, her hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, her jaw tight, her eyes staring at a point far away. At last she spoke, her voice low but steady, carrying the weight of decision. "I would rather scrub dishes in freedom than live in a palace as a prisoner." The words hung in the air like a declaration, quiet, but immovable. Eliza felt her chest tighten, pride swelling at the strength threaded through the fragile figure before her. This was no longer the girl curled up in the alley, shivering under a hoodie. This was a woman refusing chains, even if those chains glittered like jewels. Eliza crossed the room and sat opposite her, saying nothing at first, simply letting the silence carry the truth of Leah's choice. Rain pattered faintly against the glass, the city moving outside in its endless rush, but inside, the cafe became a place of resolve. Leah's lips trembled slightly, but her eyes did not waver. She was choosing hardship over pretense, authenticity over a life scripted by others. Eliza reached across the table, her hand resting briefly on Leah's, steadying, grounding. Then she gave a small nod, the gesture simple but full of understanding. Whatever came next, they both knew it would not be easy, but the path had been chosen. Leah had claimed her freedom not with shouts or rebellions, but with quiet defiance, a truth sharper than any cage of wealth could contain. The storm arrived not with thunder in the sky, but with the heavy tread of polished shoes on the cafe's worn floor, the bell above the door chiming once before silence fell across the room. 3 men in tailored coats entered, their presence filling the space with a coldness that smothered the usual warmth of clinking mugs and soft jazz. Their eyes swept the cafe like searchlights, and when they landed on Leah in the corner booth, her face drained of color, the fragile piece she had carved shattering instantly. The tallest of the men produced a thick envelope stamped with the Sterling crest. His voice clipped and official as he announced they carried legal authority to detain her for medical evaluation. His words were polished but laced with power, the kind of power that never asked but commanded. Leah's hands tightened around her teacup, her shoulders curling inward, but before she could speak, Eliza was already moving. She crossed the room with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Her apron still dusted with flour, her chin lifted like a shield. She stepped squarely between Leah and the men, her body a line drawn across the polished boots and expensive suits. Her voice was firm, resonant despite the thundering of her heart. "She is not your asset. She is a person." The words struck the air like a challenge, silencing even the low hum of the espresso machine. One of the men frowned, his hand tightening on the envelope as though it were a weapon. "Miss, this is a legal matter," he said coolly. Eliza did not move. Her stance was not loud or dramatic, but unyielding, rooted in a truth stronger than fear. Customers watched from their tables, some whispering, some frozen. The café suddenly transformed into a stage where wealth and control clashed against the raw power of conviction. Leah's breath came in shallow gasps behind her, but her eyes widened as she watched Eliza stand unwavering. For the first time in her life, someone was willing to place themselves in the path of the sterling machine, not for profit or power, but because they saw her humanity. The men shifted, their authority challenged not by force but by refusal. The envelope was placed sharply on the counter, the tallest man's eyes narrowing with warning. "We will return," he said, his tone edged with steel. With that, they turned and left, their departure marked by the sharp chime of the bell and the echo of threat lingering like smoke. Eliza let out a breath she had been holding, her hands trembling only once the door shut behind them. She turned back to Leah, who was staring at her with tears brimming in her eyes, a mixture of fear, gratitude, and disbelief. In that moment, the roles of waitress and heiress, protector and fugitive, collapsed into something more profound. The storm had hit, but Eliza had stood firm, and for the first time Leah understood she was not alone in the fight for her freedom. The café had barely reopened the next morning when Eliza noticed the shift in atmosphere, a buzz that seemed to follow every customer through the door. Some looked around with wide eyes as though expecting to see something remarkable. Others whispered while pulling out their phones, the glow of screens reflecting headlines and videos that had spread like fire overnight. Eliza's heart sank when she caught sight of the footage for the first time, shaky but clear, captured on a customer's phone during the confrontation. It showed Leah pressed into the corner booth, her body stiff with fear, the suited men looming with their legal documents. And then Eliza herself stepping forward, apron dusted with flour, voice ringing out steady and fierce. "She is not your asset. She is a person." The moment had been raw, unplanned, but the internet had seized it, replaying it in endless loops, overlaying it with captions, flooding it across platforms with commentary that grew louder by the hour. Amelia Sterling spotted alive in small café. Heiress declares independence. Billionaire father accused of treating daughter as property. The narrative twisted, not against her, but for her. Sympathy surging where scandal had once reigned. Hashtag Let Her Be Free pulsed across feeds, climbing into trending lists. Strangers from every corner of the world sharing support, outrage, and solidarity. Outside the café, news vans gathered, their antennas rising like skeletal fingers into the morning sky. Reporters huddled in the drizzle, waiting for a glimpse of the girl in the hoodie who had become a symbol overnight. Eliza pulled the blinds low, shielding Leah from curious eyes. But the weight of it was undeniable. The world knew now. Leah sat at the back of the café, her phone buzzing with messages she refused to answer, her expression a fragile mix of relief and dread. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Eliza placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "You wanted freedom. This is what it looks like." Leah's eyes glistened, the enormity of the moment pressing down on her. But beneath the fear there was something steadier, a spark of resolve that had not been there before. For once, she was not running unseen through alleys and shadows. She was standing in the light, and the world was standing with her. The café, once an anonymous refuge, had become a battleground of narratives. But for the first time, the power dynamic tilted. No longer was she just the heiress, hunted by her father's men. She was Amelia Sterling, the young woman fighting for autonomy, and millions were watching, demanding she be allowed to live her own life. The days that followed blurred into a whirlwind of flashing cameras, unanswered calls, and headlines that stretched Leah's story into every corner of the public eye. Yet within the chaos, Eliza kept her focus sharp, refusing to let the frenzy swallow the girl who had first arrived on a rain-soaked crate outside her café. She reached into the quiet network she had once leaned on herself, when her brother's care had nearly collapsed her under medical debt. The memory of a kind pro bono lawyer who had helped her negotiate impossible bills still etched in her heart. With careful persistence, she tracked him down, explaining the impossible situation with measured urgency. To her surprise, he listened without hesitation and agreed to represent Leah, not for money or recognition, but because the injustice resonated too sharply to ignore. The cafe became their makeshift war room. Papers spread across the corner booth, Leah's trembling hands steadying as she signed affidavits, her voice stronger each time she told her story. Not as a secret whispered in the dark, but as testimony meant to stand in court. The day of the hearing arrived with skies bright and clear, a strange contradiction to the storm of nerves inside them. Eliza sat at the back of the courtroom, her heart pounding as Leah stood before the judge, flanked by her lawyer on one side and her father's legal army on the other. Charles Sterling's presence filled the room like ice, his expression carved into cold marble. But Leah's chin lifted, her voice unwavering as she recounted the manipulation, the forced engagement, the suffocating control. For once, she was not silenced by wealth or power. She was speaking, and the world was listening. The argument stretched long, but the tide had already shifted outside these walls, public sentiment echoing in every headline, every trending post. The judge, after long deliberation, delivered a ruling that cracked the Sterling grip wide open. Amelia Sterling, known to Eliza and the world now as Leah, was granted full legal emancipation, the chains of guardianship broken. Furthermore, access to her private trust was released into her own hands, her life and resources no longer locked behind her father's signature. Eliza exhaled in relief she had not realized she had been holding, her eyes blurring with pride as Leah sat back, her face pale but glowing with the fierce light of someone reclaiming her own power. Outside, cameras flashed and voices clamored, but in the quiet of that moment, Leah turned to Eliza with a look that carried gratitude deeper than words. The girl who had once been hidden and hunted now stood free, her future no longer dictated by cold contracts but shaped by her own will. The stakes that had bound her were resolved not by flight or fear but by courage and truth, and as Eliza reached out to squeeze her hand, the bond they had forged in secrecy now stood unbreakable in the open. The months after the court ruling unfolded like the slow unfurling of spring, each day carrying with it the weight of choice and the quiet joy of freedom. Leah did not return to the marble halls or glittering galas that had once defined her family name. Instead, she slipped into a rhythm of simplicity, walking the same streets where she had once hidden, sitting in the cafe that had become both her refuge and her crucible. Yet she was not content to simply survive. One evening, seated across from Eliza at the corner booth where so much of their story had begun, she spread out papers and sketches, her eyes alight with something fierce and hopeful. She spoke of using a portion of her money not to replicate the empire she had fled but to build something new, something born of the very pain that had once caged her. A non-profit cafe, she explained. A place that would hire homeless youth and survivors of abuse, giving them the same chance she had been given. A chance to be seen, to belong, to start again. Eliza listened, her heart swelling as she realized the vision was not just charity, it was transformation, a way to turn wounds into shelter for others. When Leah slid a document across the table, offering her the role of co-director, Eliza felt her throat tighten, the words catching before they could form. She saw in that moment the arc of her own life bending, the waitress who had once carried bills and grief on her shoulders now being invited to lead something larger, something meaningful. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered yes, the words soft but certain. the culmination of years of sacrifice and resilience. Together they walked through the empty building that would become their second café, the walls bare, the air smelling faintly of dust and paint. Yet as they stood there, the light pouring through tall windows, it already felt alive, already filled with laughter and possibility. The tables would one day hold stories of second chances. The counters would hum with the energy of young people learning to rebuild, and the walls would shelter those who had once only known the cold of the streets. Leah's hand brushed Eliza's as they stood in the quiet space, both women smiling through the weight of all they had endured. They were no longer the runaway and the waitress, no longer heiress and protector. They were partners, builders of something lasting. What began as a secret hidden in the rain had become a legacy forged in compassion and defiance, a testament that survival could bloom into hope. Their story was no longer just about escaping cages. It was about opening doors for others, a beginning not just for them, but for countless lives yet to walk through the cafe's doors. The cafe smelled of fresh paint and hope, the soft murmur of hammers from volunteers echoing through the wide open space that was slowly transforming into their non-profit dream. Amid the bustle, Eliza's phone buzzed with a call from the director of a specialized care program she had applied to months ago for her brother. She stepped into the quiet of the alley to answer, her heart pounding as the voice on the other end explained he had been accepted. His spot secured, his fees fully covered for an entire year. The words seemed impossible, a weight lifting so suddenly from her shoulders that her knees weakened. She returned inside, her eyes wide and glistening, and found Leah waiting at one of the unfinished tables, her posture calm but her gaze knowing. When Eliza managed to whisper the news, her voice shaking with disbelief, Leah smiled softly and reached across the table. "You helped me disappear," she said gently. "Now let me help you build something." The truth clicked in Eliza's chest like the last piece of a puzzle. Leah had quietly made the donation. Her wealth turned not into control or chains, but into freedom for the one person Eliza had sacrificed everything to protect. For a long moment, Eliza could not speak, her throat thick with emotion. All the nights of scrubbing dishes until her hands cracked. All the hours spent folding her dreams into silence so her brother could have a future. All of it had led to this moment where someone had finally lifted the burden she had carried alone for so long. She pressed a hand over Leah's, tears slipping free, a mix of gratitude and awe. The roles had shifted, the protector becoming the one protected, the giver receiving in return. Around them, the cafe continued to hum with its slow rebirth, but in that quiet corner the two women sat tethered by a bond deeper than circumstance, each having given the other a future they could not have claimed alone. For Eliza, the moment was not just relief. It was the emotional payoff of years of sacrifice finally honored. For Leah, it was the chance to step fully into the life she had chosen, not a pawn or a prisoner, but a friend, a partner, a force for good. Together, they had rewritten not only their own stories but the legacy of what survival could mean. The grand opening of the new cafe dawned bright, the air humming with nervous energy and the scent of freshly ground beans. Volunteers, once strangers, now bustled behind the counter with proud smiles, while banners strung across the windows announced the mission in bold letters: a place for second chances. Eliza stood near the register, her brother seated comfortably nearby with a new tablet in his hands, his grin wide as he tapped happily at the screen. Leah moved through the space with calm grace, greeting guests, adjusting a vase of wildflowers, her eyes shining not with the fear that once shadowed her but with purpose. The tables filled quickly with neighbors and reporters alike, laughter and conversation spilling into the air. Yet in the doorway stood a girl who did not move to join them. Her coat was dirty, threadbare at the sleeves, her hair matted, her wary eyes scanning the room as though she expected to be chased away. For a long moment she hovered at the threshold, a shadow of who Leah herself had once been. Without hesitation, Leah picked up a steaming cup from the counter, her steps sure as she crossed the floor. She stopped in front of the girl, her smile soft, her voice carrying the weight of memory and transformation. "You look like you need something warm." The girl blinked, startled, her hands trembling as she accepted the cup, her fingers curling around the heat as though it were the first kindness she had felt in weeks. Eliza watched from across the room, her chest tightening with a mix of pride and awe, knowing she was witnessing a circle close and a new one begin. The café that had once been a place of refuge for one frightened heiress was now becoming a sanctuary for countless others. Each step echoing the moment Eliza had first carried coffee into the rain for a shivering stranger. The past and the present folded together seamlessly in that simple act, a reminder that hope does not end but continues, passed from hand to hand like a warm cup on a cold day. The café glowed in the golden wash of evening, its tables alive with laughter, its walls carrying the warmth of new beginnings. Eliza moved through the space with a steady calm, her brother waving at her from his corner, volunteers laughing as they wiped down counters, and Leah standing near the window, her posture tall, her face lit by the fading Sunday. The memory of that first morning still flickered in Eliza's mind. A girl in a ragged coat, shivering on a crate, hiding from a world that wanted to own her. Now that same girl handed out coffee and hope with hands no longer trembling but sure, planting seeds of change in every stranger she welcomed. The hum of conversation dimmed in Eliza's ears as her thoughts rose above the noise, her voice carrying like a gentle truth. You never know who someone really is until you see who they are when no one is watching. Leah was not just a runaway. She was a revolution waiting to begin. The words lingered, wrapping around the clinking mugs and the soft music, a final reflection that honored not just the girl who had chosen freedom but the bond that had made it possible. Their story was more than escape. It was the proof that courage and kindness could bend the shape of lives, turning despair into legacy. As the lights of the café spilled out onto the street, the night beyond seemed less dark, as though the revolution had already begun. If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes, please show your support with a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your encouragement helps us keep sharing stories that matter. Make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss the next journey of resilience and hope. And share this video with a friend who might need to remember that freedom, change, or even a brand new beginning can start with something as small as a single act of kindness. Thank you for being here with us.